Hey there, welcome back to my tutorial on building a Simon game. This tutorial I'm going to try and go over the basics of setting up a game manager or a game class. Some people don't like to use the word manager, but in this case this could be just the Simon game. Anyway, that class is going to control whose turn it is. It's going to record when Simon takes his turn, and then it's going to check when the player takes their turn to see if the player's turn lines up with Simon's turn, and then starts the game over when the player makes a mistake, which will inevitably happen. We're not going to worry about making the level harder or adding the number of selections every round. I'm going to try and keep it short. If there happens to be time, I'll see if I can push further into those things. But to start off with, I'm going to go over where we left off with in the last tutorial. So here we go. The last tutorial, we basically left it here where we were able to select buttons as the player. And again, this whole system is based on a Raycast that shoots out from the camera. Just to illustrate that, I'll go ahead and modify, I'll modify the player class so that we can take a look at this Raycast that's being drawn here. So we have a ray that shoots out from the camera. So there's the camera, it's a 3D camera. It shoots out a ray and checks whether it intersects with any objects in the scene. There's a very easy way in Unity to view this ray. So you can say debug.draw ray, and then you can take the ray itself and you can say its origin as the first parameter, and then the ray direction as the second parameter. And you can give it a third parameter like a color. Say we want it to be color.green. Another parameter like a duration. Maybe we want 3 seconds. And the depth test. Anyway, we'll leave it there for now. But this will give us an easy way to visualize the array in the scene, the ray in a scene as we shoot it off. So I'm going to go back here, hit play. I'm going to drag my game window over to the side. You'll see the ray shoots off over here. Actually, it's not long enough. But so you can see how the ray is kind of facing the right direction. If we make the ray longer, which we can do, we can go over here, we can add a new, check some of these overloads. There's a depth test, there's a direction. So I'm not sure if the direction gives us the length. But we can try that. The other question is what the depth test actually does. Should the line be obscured by other objects? Yeah, it doesn't. But let's try direction times 100. Just for the sake of it. See what happens here. Okay, there we go. So you can see we're slicing through those lines, or through those objects. Kind of neat. If we change the color there, maybe we want a red. It might be a little easier to see when we collide with the green object. So there you go. All right. So there you go. That's a nice, easy way to kind of look and see what your rays are doing. Get a feel for whether you're actually casting your rays in the right direction. Oftentimes it's hard to tell whether your rays are actually shooting off correctly. Excuse me, I've got a bit of a cold today. Hopefully that's not going to be a problem. All right, so getting back to Simon. We talked about Simon in the last set of tutorials. Simon basically picks out some random numbers. And right now, while those random numbers are great, they don't actually do much. So we're gonna update Simon here. One of the first things we want to do is get Simon a reference to these buttons. Simon doesn't know about the buttons in the 3D world, so Simon needs to know about them. There's several ways we can do this. I'm going to just go the easy route first And I'll go ahead and say we're going to create a serialize field, and we're going to make it a list button, and we'll say buttons. We'll set it equal to a new list of buttons. And so now what this is going to do, and actually, you know what, I want to go ahead and make this, not this. Where's the number of choices? Number of choices right here. Ooh, I've got that set to 1500. That's probably too high. I'm going to make this a serialized field as well. I'm going to set this to 2 to start with. This number of choices. That way we can see it in the editor. We come back in here and let this update. So it compiles a new script, and it shows us here. We've got our number of choices. We've got our buttons array. Now buttons array has this nice little triangle next to it. We can expand that, and then we can copy our buttons in. If you wanted to copy all the buttons in, by the way, right now you can only copy one at a time in. So if I grab multiple buttons, you'll see it switches the inspector to whatever game object I'm on. So you can lock the inspector up here with a little lock icon, select all your buttons, and just drag them right in. So now Simon has an idea of the buttons in the game scene. And what this gives us the ability to do is tell Simon to actually play the buttons. So in our take turn, we had him choose all of the buttons. So we could have him play the buttons as well. So we could tell him to say buttons, choices I. Now choices I is a random number between 0 and 4, which will line up well with our buttons because our buttons is an array with elements 0 through 3. When you do Unity random.range, if you just roll over the word range, you can see it's inclusive on the min, so the 0 is included, and then it's exclusive on the max, so 4 is excluded. So 0, 1, 2, 3, that's actually 4 numbers. So it's giving us choices between 0 and 4. If we ever had more buttons than the ones we have in our game right now, we'd have to update this random range so we could select more of them. But so let's go ahead and see what happens here now that we've activated each button. And we're going to see that there's going to be a problem here. I'm not going to say what it is right now, but we'll just watch and see what happens. So all the buttons just got pressed. Our number of choices is flying. So number of choices is getting higher because take turn here is updating the number of choices. Let's say we don't want to update that. Let's say we just want to take turn once right now. We'll put this in the start. So on start, it's going to take a turn. So there, it just shut off the green button, it looks like. And then the red button. Let's go back in here. Let's see what Activate is doing. Activate is not actually logging anything to our debugger. Let's go ahead and log something here. Debug.log. And we'll say game object.name has been pressed. So this is actually game object with a lowercase g. Right there, game object name has been pressed. So now we can see down here, green button has been pressed and blue button has been pressed. But what's kind of confusing, I'm going to set this up to 10 so we can see it a little better, is that all the buttons get pressed at the same time. And I set it to 10 choices, and yet it only fired off 3 there. It fired off 3 because the activate method returns. If the button's animating, it won't fire off. It'll just return out of this activate method and not do anything. So it's like we're pressing it while the button is down, which doesn't result in anything. But we can see one of the problems there is that there's no delay. Simon's pressing the buttons right away. The buttons expect to have at least some delay before they get pressed again. So what we can do is we can, instead of doing this, we can create a coroutine. So let's go ahead and make an I enumerator. This is going to be, let's call it press buttons. And what this is going to do is it's going to run through all of our choices. So for int I equals 0, I is less than choices.length dot count, I plus plus. And it's okay if this is getting a little complicated, but just go ahead and repeat this as you do it. You'll start to understand more and more why these things work and how they work. And certainly feel free to use the reference to understand how this stuff is working, and I encourage you to debug log as much of this as you can, or use the Visual Studio debugger, which I can go over in a little bit here. But so now we've got press buttons, and what we're going to do in press buttons is call the button just like we did up here. And actually we can just copy this line here. Why don't we just grab that and paste it right here. And we're going to call button choices. And now since we're in an enumerator, we're going to yield return new wait for seconds, and we can wait for 1/4 of a second. I'm not sure exactly how long we created our animation on our buttons. It looks like it might be a little longer than 1/4 of a second, whatever button speed is here. You set it to 1/10 of a second, so that's 1/10, 2/10, 3/10 of a second before the animation finishes. So let's go ahead and set this to 3/10 of a second. We can give it just a little bit of padding. Let's set it to 35/10 a second. Okay, so let me go back here. I'm going to hit play. And actually, before I hit play, press buttons is not being called anywhere. So we took our turn at the start. Take turn returns choices. We don't really need to worry about that since we have our choices list here. But now we want to start our coroutine. So our coroutine, press buttons. And we'll give this an open close parens. And we'll see now that nothing happens. And why hasn't anything happened? Good question. So let's see here. So on start, take turn. Once we're done taking turns, we could start our coroutine, and really we could just put this here at the end of take turn. So why didn't this do anything? Let's go ahead and hit play again. Yep, nothing's fired off. So let's just reason this out here. It starts, it fires off this take turn. It's number of choices, which should be 10 here. We don't need to initialize this to 2. Go ahead and set that to 10. And then once take turn kicks in, it creates this coroutine choices. Could be that choices is a new list. And maybe we do need to send this choices array in here, because we're not, actually instead of sending it in here, what we can do is not initialize this here. And we can make this a list of integers, list. And because it's a list, we don't have to initialize the number of items in here. We do need to allocate space for it. We're going to cancel this debug here, and we'll just return a list. Now this is going to break some other stuff. So let's go ahead and actually, instead of breaking this, why don't we update it? So we're going to take in a list of integers. And then this is going to be choices 0, I to num. You don't really need this anymore. Doesn't hurt. Num choices. Okay, well that shouldn't break anything. Okay, let's get rid of that just for legibility. Okay, so we should be functional again. And we're not. Argument is out of range. Says that's happening on line 34. Once again, our console is extremely important down here. Line 34 of Simon. That's right here. Choices I, engine range. And that's why this is not functioning. So maybe we should restart. This really should be choices.add. And we'll just add this here. That should work. Okay, there we go. It should have been 10 button presses. So we can count this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Great, 10 button presses. And we can see which buttons have been pressed. Okay, so that's pretty good. All right, so now that we've got that going, now we want to be able to call take turn from the game manager, the game script, and we will send in the number of choices, and then the game script will play the coroutine. Simon will play the coroutine to actually fire off each button, and our game manager will listen to each button being fired off, store those in an array. So let's go ahead and create a game manager, or a Simon game script. We'll call this Simon game. So come back in here, right click, we want to go into our scripts directory, right click, click on create, call this Simon game, go ahead and open it. Now this will have a reference to both players, Simon player, we'll call it Simon player, and player, and we'll just call it player. And then we'll also have a reference to our buttons. We'll do the same thing we did in Simon. This button. So we can expose these all publicly. That's fine. Not by serialized field. They're not really being exposed publicly. They're being exposed in the editor here by doing this. And we'll go back at our script to Simon. Let's put Simon in the middle, 0, 0, 0. So now he's at 0, 0, 0. Let's make sure all the players are also at 0, 0. The buttons are at 0, 0. Now here's what I'm going to do. Just to keep this organized, I'm going to take player and buttons, put them under Simon game. Simon game, again, could dynamically just find everybody that's needed for the game on awake or on start, but I'm going to go ahead and link these guys manually just to keep this simple and straightforward. Okay, so I've got my 4 buttons, I've got Simon, and I've got player. Now we're going to make a modification to our button script so that our game, actually we don't have to, we've got button pressed right here and it sends the button. So we don't have to make any modifications here. What we will need to do is specify whose turn it is. We can do this with a simple integer. If it's 1, if it's 0, if this is 0, then it's Simon's turn. If it's 1, then it's the player's turn. Okay, and actually, why don't we go ahead and move this up here. Okay, so on start, we're going to set the number of, we'll also have another integer for number of tiles. We'll set that to 2 to begin with. And we're going to have our update loop here. This is going to be our level. If turn, say if not turn, then it's, this is if it's Boolean. If turn equals 0, it's Simon's turn. If turn equals 1, it's player's turn. Okay. Now what did we say we needed for this? We need an array. We could make, let's do, for simplicity's sake, a list of strings. And say Simon's selection, or Simon's turn. The reason I'm doing a string is that we are going to record the button names that he picks. So one of the first things we need to do is we need to go through each button. So each button in buttons, we want to hook up, and call this buttons plural. We want to hook up an event listener. So we're going to say b dot button pressed plus equals handle button pressed, and let it create that object for me. I'm going to right click here. You can also control period to get this. It's going to give you some recommendations. I'll select the top one. And so now we'll just debug log this so we know what's going on. Game manager, we'll say Simon game here. A button was pressed. It's called obj.name. There we go. We'll color this. Color equals green. Well, plus close color. There we go. Okay. Now we need a Boolean turn taken equals false. And here we'll say if the turn is 0. Well, let's just make sure that this is outputting properly first. So we'll go ahead and hit play. We'll let it compile. We'll hit play. You can see here, buttons are pressed, but my game manager is not outputting anything to do with these buttons. And it looks like I haven't linked the buttons in. So let me make sure this is locked. Drag the buttons into the editor here. Boom. Okay. Can unlock that. Now let me hit play again. Simon game here. There we go. So the buttons were pressed. So now we want to record this button press order or sequence. So I'm going to go ahead and say if it's Simon's turn, if turn equals 0, then let's record these buttons. And I created this Simon's turn dot add obj.name. So there we go. We've got Simon's turn. Once this is all done, we'll have a list of all the objects that Simon pressed. And then we can say Simon's turn count. We want to know if Simon's turn.count equals number of tiles, or we could say number of presses. Let's say number of presses. That seems to make a little more sense. Presses. So if it equals the number of presses, then we'll say it's not Simon's turn anymore. Turn equals 1. So now it's the player's turn. Right? And so in here, if it's the player's turn, and actually before that, let's go ahead and say Simon's turn is done. Let's debug log this. Simon game here. Simon has finished his turn. Let's output. Now we're going to have to output Simon's selection. And we'll go ahead and continue with the green coloring. Okay, because this is a list, I want to control period this again. Control period. I'm not hitting period. There we go. So it gives me a recommendation. I hit enter. It creates the method for me. Because Simon's selection, or Simon's turn, is a list, I can't just print the list to the screen. It's going to give me an object. So I want to return a string. Simon's selection string. So I'm going to create a string. I'll call it Simon's selection string. And I'll say for each string s in Simon's turn, Simon's, and I made the longest possible variable name here, equals s plus comma. There we go, Simon's selection string. All right, that's this. I have to initialize it to a blank string first. And here I have to make sure I have this properly. Okay, so now this should let us see what Simon has selected. So let's go ahead and hit play. Simon. Okay, it actually outputs here. Simon has finished his turn. It's doing that because Simon game thinks that the turn length is 2. But Simon is taking a turn of 10. So here you can see our Simon game has the number of turns set to 2. But Simon decided he wants to take 4 turns. And that's because we made a number of choices here that he's using. So take turn here should really be sent a certain number of turns. And Simon shouldn't go until the Simon game script tells him to go. So on start, we want to tell Simon first to go. So we'll tell Simon take, and our reference is Simon lowercase, take, that is our reference, Simon player, take turn. We'll say number of presses. Okay. And we're going to see that this logic isn't going to work out all that well for us. I mean, we'll have to do some tricky stuff here because Simon's turn will happen. We'll want him to take his turn, and then he'll have to move into another state, or the game will have to move into another state waiting for Simon's turn. And that's partially why I put this Boolean in here. But we'll go ahead and do this first, and we'll stop Simon from taking his turn right off the bat. So Simon will take his turn when we tell him to take his turn. So Simon took 2 turns, and then returned those 2 turns, yellow button, green button. So now it would be my turn, and I'd have to hit yellow button and then green button for it to take another turn. So I'm going to leave it there for now. We've already gone half an hour, which is quite a long ways. And we'll continue in the next series, in the next video, to just kind of wrap this up, finish off Simon's functionality, and finish off the game, Simon game objects functionality, so that it controls the game properly. But you can see kind of where we're going right now. Now, hopefully you've learned a little bit about raycasting, a little more about raycasting, and a little bit about how to use the editor to link objects together. In the future, we can talk about ways to do this dynamically in script so that you don't have to link everything together, so that your game could grow from 4 buttons to 100 buttons or 8 buttons, whatever. So, okay, I'm going to leave it there. See you in the next one.